Pokemon cards are shifting pretty rapidly, and I think right now it's a good idea to look at Pokemon cards that are currently moving in the market versus the ones that are currently dropping pretty steadily. And right now, there's actually a few more cards that are dipping than rising. And I think it's pretty funny how things are going right now because it seems no one can catch a breath in the hobby, and I'm going to show you some of the price movements in a second, but the way Pokemon cards have been has just been literal insanity. And what's funny is if some cards were climbing or dropping, like a few dollars, it wouldn't be anything special. It's the fact that a lot of cards, I mean, they change in like increments of like $100 or even $200 in a month. And I think that's what makes people be so glued to Pokemon cards because they literally change so quickly. So, like sometimes you'll look at a card that you own in a binder and it's going absolutely nowhere. And then all of a sudden you're going to see a big price spike. And I mean, that's kind of what's happening right now. Check these out. All right, there is so much movement happening in the market. Now, some cards are climbing up, but there's so many cards dipping. The 151 Charizard is definitely one that we need to look out for at the moment. Pokemon 151 has been going on like weird movements recently. As you can see, just on that 3-month snapshot, you can see early it just started climbing and then now it's dipping again. And this is the thing, right? Cards are just going wild at the moment in terms of the price movements, in terms of price fluctuations. People just don't know what's going to be the next move, right? People are just thinking, hey, are cards going to climb in price now? Are they going to dip? A little bit of fear has set in with some people because they can see movements are, going more in a downward trajectory. Not all cards, but there are some cards rising as well. But generally like the wave of the community right now is in a downward trend. We can see with the 151 Charizard, it was selling for 304 USD. And right now it's selling for 260. Now that is, $40, off your high point is a fair bit of chunk that's just been wiped off, in a matter of a few weeks, right? And this is the crazy part that's happening right now because a lot of people expected that the 151 Charizard and all cards that are Pokemon 151 are just going to be, endlessly climbing. The thing what's really flipped the script right now is because the time period that we're in right now is traditionally the time that cards start climbing in price. So now we're actually seeing the reverse happen, which is a little bit like, whoa, massive shakeup. There's a few things that are causing a shakeup. Another big shakeup in the hobby is the fact that sealed booster boxes and sealed product is actually coming down in price without a lot of these cards or sets having reprints. That is also pretty unheard of, okay? So that's also caused a little bit of confusion in the hobby, though you can see, like, having the Charizard right now at 260, it's not the most difficult card to pull, but then again, seeing such an iconic card as well start losing price as well, it is a little bit of a unique time at the moment. And of course, the iconic Bubble Mew was selling for $701, and right now it has been on a fairly big downward trend, selling for $571. Now, sure, it seems like a big dip from, the $701 price point. But if we just zoom out, okay, and we go into the 6-month timeline, I mean, it is pretty obvious that that card is well up just when you look at that snapshot right there. 6 months ago, this card was selling, consistently at around 300 US. So it still is much above that kind of point right now, even though it has gone through a massive hype swing and now it's kind of tapered off a little bit. Bubble Mew, as iconic as it is, I do think it's one of the more iconic cards of the Scarlet and Violet era. But in saying that, we are dealing with just weird price fluctuations at the moment. And I think, I'm very interested to know your thoughts, but with the way the market's moving, it is looking a bit bizarre. Now, one that is climbing in price is the Zekrom EX from Black Bolt. Check this one out. Selling for $391. Found a little bit of a low point in the last 3 months for 389 US. Right now selling for $478. A fairly big price jump. These monochromatic cards are incredibly rare. To be honest, I actually thought that these wouldn't really hold as well as they have. I'm actually quite surprised seeing that the market has shifted for these cards in particular, and that might be just a seasonality thing, and it also might be that we've had so much kind of, illustration rares, special illustration rares, that people are kind of welcoming a new kind of artwork to join, okay? And I think because of that, I think a lot of people are saying, you know what, I've got so many special illustration rares, I've got so many illustration rares, but maybe cards like these monochromatic cards right now, maybe they're a bit more exciting for collectors. Maybe when they see that, they're like, you know what, this looks a bit more exciting than all these illustration rares lately. I don't know, and that's the thing, and the kind of rhythm of how collectibles work. There is always this shift and perception of what people like, and it's very much in just like trending like music or trending in terms of fashion or anything like that, but it moves in a quicker scale, right? So one thing, you know, sometimes things are just popular and sometimes they aren't. Now also, while looking at these cards, I actually researched all the cards shown in this video using the Collector app, and Collector are the sponsors of today's video. Now, Collector is one of the best ways to track and manage your collectibles, as it's a digital collectible portfolio manager. The real key is that not only does it store your collectible info in one place, but it updates the pricing with the real-time market, so you can literally see how all your cards and sealed products move over time. Now, as awesome as it is to track your collectibles, I actually love Collector for its research capabilities. With tools like Set Analytics, you can actually research any Pokemon set and get a full overview of everything about it, from the market movers within the set to the rarity breakdown, and even have a volatility score which updates based on recent price fluctuations. Upgrading to Collector Pro is also very useful because you can scan cards in the app using your phone's camera. Honestly, having Collector in your toolkit is essential when collecting trading cards, and you can find all the details to download Collector within the video's description. A big thanks to Collector for always supporting the channel. Now let's keep going. Now moving on to one that is climbing is the Prismatic Evolutions Umbreon. It was selling for $839 US, and you can see right now selling for $1,200. This card in particular has been on a bit of an upwards climb as well, and you know, it has kind of avoided the dip that's kind of happened recently, or the dip that we're currently in right now. This one in particular hasn't really been affected by that. I mean, there's a few reasons like why this is happening. I think Umbreon is just such a centerpiece in terms of collectibles. I think this card is such a perfect fit with Umbreon in terms of, you know, top kind of Eeveelution for an Umbreon artwork. If these Eeveelution theme sets continue, like how we had Evolving Skies in 2021, Prismatic Evolutions in 2025, and you know, if there's another Eeveelution set, you know, 3 or 4 years down the line, there might be a thing where the Umbreon chase cards are just always the ones that people go for, and they're just going to become very, very like sought after because there's this new whole Eeveelution era. Now, Eeveelution cards, you know, all the Eeveelutions were very popular in 2021, and of course they maintained that popularity even in 2025. You know, Evolving Skies and Prismatic Evolutions were both incredibly popular sets for their time period. Will the next era, when we're in Gen 10, and there is another Eeveelution theme set, if there is one, will it also maintain that same kind of like trajectory in terms of how much, you know, it climbs in price? Because at this stage, I think it's very likely. I think people are really glued to these Eeveelutions, and you know, they're just obsessed with them at the moment. So I think one thing about the Eeveelutions and everything, I just noticed that like what collectors prefer has changed a little bit as well. You know, especially early days, it was all just about Charizard, you know, Venusaur, Blastoise, right? You know, especially those early days. People love their Charizard cards, and people just love Charizard of like the early 90s. Now it's kind of transitioned so much in terms of the collector of Pokemon. And I always say this, but you know, because I work in marketing, so I always think of like demographics and how kind of like, you know, in marketing, you always have to think of, you know, the general age of anything that you market to, or, you know, all these things come in place, you know, the income bracket, all that, right? When I think of Pokemon, okay, I wouldn't be able to ever tell you who the demographic of Pokemon collectors are. You know, everyone says, you know, with Pokemon games, oh, it's kids, you know, everyone goes, no, kids play Pokemon games. But I don't know if that's true either, because I know there is a massive audience of adults that still play Pokemon games. When people say, oh no, the games are for kids, they probably are, you know, Pokemon probably designs them that way. But in terms of people who actually play, you would get a lot of adults who still play the games, okay? You have so much adults, you know, buying Pokemon cards, you know, whether they're trying to like add them to their collection, the grading culture, you know, it's shifted so much. So in terms of the market of who collects Pokemon or who engages in Pokemon, it literally is so widespread. You have kids, of course, and then you have, you know, they're probably, I think, like around that teenage 14, 15, 16 area is probably where people fade away a little bit. But I do think that they actually kind of enter the Pokemon hobby as they get a little bit older. If it's going, you know, anything of how the trajectory of like, you know, the 90s kids went, because I'm just talking about my experience, but I think it's like a pretty, like just especially with this channel and seeing how a lot of people came back into the hobby. But I think that transition of Pokemon, you know, you had that early 90s kid, and then that early 90s kid would play, you know, Pokemon Red, Pokemon Blue, you know, they moved on to, you know, Gold, Silver, Ruby, Sapphire, Diamond and Pearl. And then I know from my experience around the, black-white era, that's where I started fading away a little bit from Pokemon in a way. I was playing the games, but because, at that time when they came out, I was 15 years old. So, I was a teenager, going out, friends, this, that. So I kind of faded away a little bit with Pokemon during that time. And then Black White 2 came out. Even though I did play the games, I don't think I was that hooked into the series at that point like I used to be. And then what was interesting with XY era, I actually got hooked back in because it was like, wow, this feels like a little bit of a refresh point. I remember the 3DS graphics. I was like, whoa, this is a big shift, right? And I think that kind of journey is similar but different for a lot of people. And I wonder if Pokemon kind of tracks that market behavior, or how people kind of leave the hobby or re-enter, because it is interesting. Now, moving on to one that is dropping is the Gardevoir Special Illustration Rare, selling for $318 US. Right now, selling for $228. That is a big chunk of value that's coming down right now for that Gardevoir. Awesome special illustration rare. Very, very, hard card to pull. But, the whole era of Mega Evolution, cards are just dropping. And I think when I'm about to show you, the sealed product as well, I think Mega Evolution didn't kind of tick the boxes for a lot of collectors like they hoped. I'm just noticing this now, we're we're getting there around 2 months after its release. And I can see that, this sentiment for Mega Evolution, there is a bit more disappointment than a lot of people kind of were expecting with it. I think people expected more. And the biggest way you can see that is a lot of the prices are coming down now. And that is kind of refreshing to see because, it's just been price growth throughout all of 2025. Same thing with the Lucario Special Illustration Rare. Let's pull this into the month graph. There we go, a market high in October for $306, right? Right now, that has gone down to $237. And you know what? That looks like it's still got room to drop. And it's wild because it's such an awesome artwork. I think the reason, because it jumped eras and it was an era skip. And I think, with Legends EA and all that, I think it's been a bit of a shake-up in the hobby where some people have just said, you know what, had my fun with Scarlet and Violet era. Maybe I'll come back into the hobby when, Mega Evolution gets a little bit more deeper in the era. That's usually how it works. If we look at Sword and Shield, or even Sun Moon, or even any era, usually when a base set starts, even though this one, the Mega Evolution, it is a new jump to a new era, but it definitely feels, even though it is like a jump over, it feels like it's a little bit more of a continuation of Scarlet and Violet in its own way. But because of that little bit of a refresh point, it's almost been like a soft refresh. I feel like you've had some people, just leave right now and they're just waiting to see what happens with this era. Now, really cool ones to look at are these mega hyper rares, the Mega Evolution hyper rares. Check this out, the Gardevoir, selling for $613. Right now selling for $455. Pretty big price drop, okay? Now, these cards are so ridiculously rare. These are actually the rarest Pokemon cards in terms of that we've ever had for pull rates, right? And having such insanely difficult pull rate, I still feel they're so similar to just regular hyper rares. The only difference is a regular hyper rare, usually the Pokemon is not really colored in gold, but these ones have a golden coat all over it, and that's the big difference. But in terms of are they that different to a hyper rare, maybe for the general collectors, they're not, right? I mean, sure, you got the only difference is the Pokemon and the hyper rare is colored, but they feel so similar that I think it's made a disconnection point. All right, the Mega Evolution Enhanced Booster Box. Check it out, man. Selling for $331. Come on, man. Brand new set too, right? And of course, now that's dropped to $248. Now, that's the thing. I still think that's too expensive for a brand new set. I'm still not happy with that price point, even though it's come down. I'm grateful that it has, but I still think that that's just way, way too expensive for a brand new set. Really does have room to drop down further. I do miss the days of just being able to buy a booster box on release, and it doesn't feel like, wow. Lately with Pokemon products, and I know everyone's probably feeling the same, every time you buy a booster box, you just feel like, it's such a big, financial commitment. Spending $250 on a booster box. Back in the day, that would have bought you 2 booster boxes. So the fact that you get one now, it definitely stings far more. Of course, what you pull as well, card prices have gone up. So, the contents that you can pull inside have at least increased in price. So if you do get a hit, you know, it's well worth it. But at the same time, you know, I think a bit more kind of like price drops would be kind of needed to keep this hobby a bit more sustainable. But you know, with the market moving like this, I feel a lot of collectors are being a bit more cautious with the market. Though, you know, it's very important to understand that Pokemon cards are very cyclical and they move in waves, and timing is one of the most important aspects about this hobby. And the reason why it's so important is actually explained in this video on screen right here. Within this video that's appearing on screen right now, I actually go over the 7 timeless rules of Pokemon collecting, and I do a big deep dive into the hobby. If you really enjoyed this video, click the video that's appearing on screen. Appreciate you watching, and I'll see you on the next video.